So we've got this sort of just culture set up within aviation. And we start off with, it's a key aspect because it looks to differentiate between sort of bona fide, good behaviors, and malfide, bad behaviors. And I'll build a little model coming up now. So those bad faith behaviors are focused on violations for personal gain, gross negligence, and sabotage. And these behaviors are subject to legal scrutiny, and we look to use rules and frameworks to punish people for those transgressions because we need to have some level of accountability and responsibility. We look to see who's guilty and what the punishment will be. The good faith behaviors are focused on slips, lapses, mistakes, human error in effect, and the drivers which lead us to take greater risks, and they should be examined in the context of learning opportunities to improve the system. The results from here cannot and should not be used to punish people. And in fact, in 2015, there were two law cases in the UK in which the Air Accident Investigation Branch refused to give cockpit voice recorded information from a helicopter crash and cockpit video from a display pilot to the courts for use in terms of an investigation, a legal criminal investigation. Because they said if we do that, we will reduce the information, the quality information that comes out that we can use this. So it's protected, which is the only places I know that this sort of information is protected. And as modern research shows, and I'll come on to this in a minute, there are two reasons really to look at an adverse event, and that's to attribute blame and it's to learn to improve the system. And unfortunately, they're pretty much exclusive because people will start closing down, and we'll come on to this as I develop this model. So we start off with, by having this just culture, it allows us to tell stories, context-rich stories, by discussing those adverse events openly, even if that means that we're talking about stupid errors or mistakes, or that we broke the rules that are out there. It's important that we understand the context and what motivated you to do what you did, because if we just look at the outcomes, we don't actually fix the problems themselves. And by telling context-rich stories, we're able to undertake an in-depth analysis to find out why the event happened in the way it did, not just stopping at human error, but looking much deeper. Was the equipment poorly designed and tested? Was it serviced at all? What was the training? Was it adequate? Was there a distraction to the person involved? Was there a checklist designed, and was it poorly framed or well framed? The term human error is only of use if you want to aggregate things up, but it adds nothing when it comes to learning. You don't stop when you found a rule has been broken or the guidance been ignored, because most people will know that such events happen and the likely reason for that final straw that broke the camel's back. And it's really important to understand the background, and that requires trust and psychological safety to be able to talk about these events. By understanding why it happened, we can develop a robust process to fix the system. Now, for example, if instructors themselves are drifting procedures, then we need to have something in place to prevent them from drifting too far. There might be local pressures which prevent them from doing that, and that could be finance. Now, blaming the individuals without fixing the systemic problems means that those latent problems will continue and somebody else will end up being fired for the same event. And that's the difference here is when we talk about high-risk industries, whether we have a safety culture, is we don't fire people for systemic problems. Because if you do that and you don't fix the problem, recruiting somebody else will lead to the same issue. Now, once we've conducted this robust analysis, we can bring us on to actually using some rules. And these just aren't the standards they're not just the standards which organizations prescribe that should be taught to prevent those bad things from happening, but also the social norms within the environment. But the rules I'm talking about here are the outcomes from this analysis. And it's not about compliance. It's about the rules which lead to more openness, and they promote and support effective decision-making and behaviors that lead to positive outcomes. So actually, let's talk about having an effective debrief that talks about, I've just had Timmy G. I've got that. That's fine. I'll pick up these. Okay, I'll pick up the comments at the end. So I'm missing those as we come along. So apologies for that. I've broken my thought now. Okay, so it's understanding how and why we go about the decisions we made and having effective debriefs so we can learn from that. Now, once we get to those behaviors, those new rules, what we recognize is that the people themselves are part of a system, that they, as we'll come on to later on in the behaviors piece, that they are subject to this. And that's a system that looks at the individuals and their mindset. The way they make decisions, the way they interact with the equipment, the way they interact as part of a team, the way they operate as part of an instructor-student relationship or as part of a wider social group, considering their local, organizational, and national cultures, and the way that they operate in line with national and international legislature. And that's the challenge, is understanding what those pressures are. And a presentation I've given previously looks at this sort of onion of human factors as part of a system. Now, something we've got to consider is that safety can never be the number one priority for an organization, because it's got to balance all of the other demands which we face: money, resource, time. If safety was the number one priority for an organization, they would likely go bust. Even airlines have to manage resources, and they will take risks as what they consider to be acceptable. And they are making gambles, very wise gambles, based on previous experiences of what is given as acceptable. And for that to happen, we've got to have knowledge. And the problem is you can't write down everything you might face, especially in the diving constraint. Now, nor can you deliver training to meet it. And that means that you yourself needs to be resilient, because the world is a messy place. Things go wrong, kit breaks. The underwater world is not the same as each time you go in it. If you're an instructor, students can be difficult. Sometimes, we've got these really difficult decisions to make as to, I've just invested a whole bunch of money going out on a trip. The weather's pretty bad. It's doable. It's supposed to be a fantastic wreck. I'm going to get in because I've spent all this money and time. And we've got this sunk cost fallacy that the more we invest, the harder it is to turn around. However, for us to develop that resilience, we need to have an idea of how to solve problems in that dynamic environment, even if that means breaking a rule or deviating from a standard operating procedure, or actually in some cases just making it up as you go along, because no one's told you how this could happen, or we make a mistake because of the number of different limitations we've got as humans. We've got a finite capacity to deal with these problems. Now, for that to happen, we need to be able to talk about the errors and the violations we've done, which means that we've got to have a just culture in place. So we need to balance these things. And that's what the next part of the presentation will look at, is what a just culture means. But before I go on to that, I'm going to give you a quote from Nancy Leveson, who wrote this book. It's a free PDF ebook. It's hard reading, but it's about trying to change the way incidents and accidents are looked at in terms of a system concept. And she's come up with this brilliant quote that blame is the enemy of safety. And, just saying here, you've got two possible goals: find someone to blame, or learn how and why it happened to prevent future occurrences, and then put something in place. Blame, as it says here, is a legal or a moral concept. It's not an engineering one. And what we're trying to do is engineer as best we can a safe world by putting processes and systems in place that manage safety. The problem is, if we focus on blame, we close people down in terms of discussions. It leads to cover-ups because people don't want to talk about it. They don't want to put themselves in the firing line. And so they cover up things as best they can. And ultimately, it reduces near-miss incident reporting. Fatalities are pretty hard to hide, although the causes behind them, it's much harder to explain because the decision maker is normally dead. And the rest of the safety world has recognized that fatalities are a poor metric to measure safety. What we really need to understand is the near misses that are out there. And the way we can get those is by discussing them and by reporting them, by having a just culture. Now, if we don't have a just culture, I'm going to go around the other way. What happens if we don't have a just culture? Well, people don't tell context-rich stories. they start to withhold the little bits of really important truths that are out there, which means that that we can't get an understanding of how and why it happened. And as a consequence, we can only do a limited amount of analysis on this. And that's where you look at the incident reporting systems at the moment, that we get a number, a few number of lines that are there. And I know in 2 weeks' time, the British Tobacco Club will present to the British Diving Safety Group the 2017 annual report. Now, the reports they've got is the best we've got in the UK, but the stuff that is reported is normally fairly generic. It doesn't give specific issues, and there is no taxonomy that looks at the role of human factors in diving incidents and accidents.
So this is
I've just heard somebody talk.
Guy giving the.
They're going to mute you now. Now, what happens there is if we don't have a rich story and we conduct in-depth analysis, as a consequence, we end up with restrictive rules because it's much easier to put rules in place to limit people's behaviors. And that means that actually we don't get a wide systems view, and we start operating in silos, so that training organizations talk about themselves, talk about their issues themselves. Well, why wouldn't one training organization have the same issues that another one does? Or a manufacturers have the same issues that other manufacturers have? We need to be able to share this information. But if we don't have this, we operate in silos and we don't get this. And that means that we end up with a weak and fragile system that means that it is easy to fail within it because we are not giving people the information they need to make adequate decisions.